Heavenly Father, we give you thanks again for this day. We give you thanks for creativity. We give you thanks for this whole concept of drawing and being able to understand it. Um, just the fact that you've made us to be able to work and um, and function with our minds, with our understanding, but also with our hearts and with our emotions and all these things. And that's just really exciting, Lord, that we can do that. So we give you thanks for that and ask for your guidance, and that we do that today. Amen. Okay, so as we go through, I'm going to be using a few objects. I have this interesting skull here. Skulls are always great for practicing because they have so many, intricate little details and stuff like that. And usually they're a lot more white than this. I'm thinking I still might actually bleach this thing, but check this out. This thing was obviously, I found this just a few days ago hiking with Bill, and actually had a plant growing through it. So still debating whether I want to keep that in there or not. So we're going to be looking at that. We're also going to be looking at using a shoe as an example to help that with. But in order to do so, I'm going to change the lighting here because when it comes to shading, we want to be able to see really good highlights and shadows. And I've got too many light sources. I've got one coming from this side, I've got one coming from this side, and one behind me. And it makes it really difficult to be able to understand it. So I'm going to turn off a number of lights here. I'm going to turn that one down. Maybe that's even just enough. Maybe the one up above me might be okay. Maybe I can just leave that one on. But even just on my face, you can see now there's a lot more obvious highlight and shadow. It's a bit harsh, but not too bad. So, but if I bring this over to the light on this side a little more, maybe I'll even turn that, then we can get a better sense of what it is that I'm talking about. Okay, so to begin with our sheet here, our paper, and let me just share that a second with the screen so that those who come on know what I'm talking about. So I'm talking about this this document right here. Okay, let me move that over a little bit, enlarge this so we can see it. Well, not quite that much. Okay, so first of all, I want to come to the purpose of shading. Okay, and the purpose of shading, as I have here, it's all right, and we're talking about realistic drawings. Okay, not just cartoon or anything, but that's, again, we want to start with realism. At least this has always been my feeling. The best place is to start from realism, and then we go from there. Abstraction should start from realism, and then we go. And first of all, it is not just to make a white page gray. Okay, so why do we shade our drawings? I have paint here. I'd probably take that out. Okay, first of all, we understand is we're trying to capture an illusion. Okay, always when we are drawing, we're just capturing an illusion of something because we're taking a three-dimensional object and we're putting it onto a two-dimensional space. And so the only way that we can do that is, because it's not real. None of our drawings are real. And so it's always just an illusion, okay? This shoe in reality is three-dimensional, but if we're going to draw it on a paper, we're going to turn that into 2 dimensions. And how do we, on a two-dimensional surface, capture the illusion of that? Okay, so that's really what we're trying to do. Okay, all right, so if we look at let's break this down. I'm going to change my view to my sheet here and take my pencil. Okay, so the purpose of shading is we want to capture the illusion. So we're going to go in the most important things, and I believe it matters that we focus first on what is the most important. Okay, so if I were to ask you guys, and you can go ahead and actually please throw out your thoughts on this, what would you all think is the most important thing that we're going to do, that you're trying to capture or trying to create the illusion of when you're drawing? What's the most important thing you want to be focusing on?
Would it be the depth for the to capture the shape, or would it be lighting?
Okay. Okay. Depth or lighting? Actually, yeah. So I would probably just use, because right now when we're talking about depth, we're talking about a whole space. So right now we're talking about just an object. Okay, but you're on the right track there. So
Three-dimensionality.
exactly. Yeah. Okay. So simply, which is on the same thing. We're going to come to depth later. So we're going to start off, as you see on my, I've actually even divided it on that page, where what applies to objects and what applies to the scene. So if we're going to go with just shading objects. Okay. So first we're starting just with objects. And that's sort of where it begins. The objects, because, you know, in any drawing, yeah, there's going to be objects or trees or something like that in a whole scene. Sometimes, not always, but typically an object is going to be a subject. So the number one most important thing is to try to get it to feel 3D, okay? Three-dimensionality, or what we also call, what we are trying to do is trying to turn shape, which is one of our elements. Shape is 2D. We're trying to turn shape into form. Okay? Whenever you hear me use the term shape, I'm talking about a two-dimensional thing, like squares. Like shape is a square or a circle. Form is like a cube. It's a horrible looking cube, okay, or a sphere. And right away when I show sphere, immediately I can't make my circle look like a sphere unless I get some shading in there. So that's our number one sort of thing. And then on this side, you know, also, okay. So that's the first thing that we're going to do. So everything, when you're shading, that's what you want to be focusing on. And as you're shading, is continue looking, am I making it look three-dimensional? Okay, that is the most important. And sadly, we often end up treating it as the least important when we're learning how. And we actually get these completely backwards. Okay, so let's go back to my shoe here. If we go back to the shoe, so let's, as we're shading this, get this over here where we can see this well. We got some highlights and shadows here. Making it look three-dimensional. Let's say we're achieving that, but now what is the next thing you think we want to capture about this shoe? Maybe if I even hold up the two of them, that might even help explain. What do you guys think? What is the second most important thing as I'm shading these objects that I want to try and capture? What do you guys think?
Value.
We're going to use value, but it's something even more specific about just the object itself. So we're going to use, value is going to be important. Value is something we're going to use. Value is one of the elements. So we're going to use value. But what are we going to use value for? We're going to use value to try and make it look three-dimensional, but we're also going to try and now capture the illusion of something else. So once we've got to look in three-dimensional, the next thing, I'll give you a hint here.
Color.
Texture.
Okay, so we've nailed them both. Let me ask you guys, color or texture, what do you think is most important? So let's just take a look at this, okay? What is most important, to capture the fact that the horns look dirty, or that the fact that this is rougher than this? What do you think is the most important thing that we want to capture? So the roughness, I'm talking about texture, or the coloration of this? What would you guys say?
Texture.
Texture, yeah, okay. Texture is the second most important thing that we want to be focusing on. So number one is three-dimensionality. Number two is the texture. Then we're focusing on texture, okay? Now let me get back up a little bit. It's not going to matter a whole lot. Like if you can draw this skull and you make it look three-dimensional, but you don't actually manage to capture the fact of how rough the horns are, that's not going to matter a whole lot, okay? If you don't actually manage to capture, like you can see the rough texture, especially in this horn here from this angle, okay? And in this one here, that's not as important as trying to make that horn look roundish, like cylindrical, okay? Like a bent cylinder. That is much more important, okay? And then the least important, and we often, when we're learning to shade, we focus on that the most. The least important is this dirt, is this brown color on here. That is so really not important at all. And when we're first shading, that's the first thing a student will focus on. They'll go to shade this, and they'll pay all sorts of attention to getting this brown in, and they won't pay attention to the shading of this shadow and this shadow here and this highlight. They don't pay attention to that. They pay attention to this, and it's actually backwards. So you need to get that to flip in your mind, okay? So that's why I always think it's so important to take this time to do this boring little exercise of taking down these notes. And we call it either the actual color or the local color, whatever you want to call it. But that is the least important. So much so, in fact, you can change that, right? And as an artist, that's usually one of the areas that we always change. Is we just decide to change that color, and you're probably going to change it for compositional purposes. You know, you could draw that skull and make it all brightly colors if you want, okay? But even if you're going to make it all blues and purples and rainbow colors, as you do so, you really still want to try and capture it to, you know, feel three-dimensional. Again, we're talking about realism, okay? Now, there's all sorts of things you can do, like Picasso and all those guys, and I'm not teaching against abstraction at all by any means. And you can certainly distort this and you can walk away from it, but if you have a stronger handle on it, when you walk away from it, you do so with purpose, okay? Abstraction should always happen on purpose, not by accident. Some may disagree with me, I suppose, and you know, we're all welcome to it. But again, I think abstraction that happens with purpose is just going to have a lot more impact to it. Okay, it's going to have a stronger expression. Okay, so far we've been talking about objects. Now let's look at scenes. If we're doing scenery. So now this is, I can't really demonstrate this because I can't really put up a scene, but what I'm talking about is actually, okay, so we have this object, I can even use myself as the object, the shading of myself. I also have the, you know, the highlights here and the shadows here, and having to get, as I'm shading this, right, paying attention, all those sort of things. But what about all the space around me? It's not a most exciting space. But now, Teresa, we're coming back to what you had said before. What do you think, with the space all around me, the lamp back behind me and the window and everything, what would you say is, you had mentioned this before, it relates to the three-dimensional aspect of objects, but when we're talking about space, then we're actually talking about, we want to capture what? And this is, anyway.
I had said depth, but I actually meant 3D.
Okay.
You said
depth, of course. Okay, so what we when doing scenes, depth is the most important. Okay, or sometimes it's just simply called space. Okay, it's another one of the elements. This was one of the ones I always get confused with, because sometimes I think it should be a principle. I always sort of thinking of principles and elements, some even those run together. Okay, so when we're capturing a scene, the first thing you want to be able to capture is the depth of it. You want to make it feel like, pretty much, that you can go into the picture. Okay, you know, not necessarily always. Again, there's always exceptions to the rule, of course, and that, as an artist, you want to be making as many exceptions to these rules as possible. Okay, but it's so good to know the rules. Okay, so after depth, so imagine you're painting some sort of landscape. or something like that, or you're just drawing a room, okay? You could be like in here, you can draw the interior of the room. Now we can't see the roof and stuff. Well, we can see a little bit there. You know, so the depth, this is perspective. See how that line coming down on an angle, all the angled lines of, I'm trying to see if I can get this out of this window shade, see how they change. That's called perspective. All of that we've captured. It looks like it's going back. What do you think would be the next important thing that we're going to do if we're shading a scene? And it's not really a good example to imagine behind me. So imagine more outdoors. That would be better. Imagine you're sitting outdoors and you're trying to shade. You're looking around and you're shading. You're doing a drawing of what you're seeing. You know, the ocean or something like that, or out in the forest.
I don't know if this is next or not, but I'm thinking about you need to consider the lighting and the depth. I mean, in the perspective.
Yeah. So perspective is depth, but the lighting exactly plays. The lighting is what we want to focus on when we're doing the next thing that we're capturing. So we'll just go ahead since you're on the right track anyway, which is the atmosphere. Okay, we want to capture the atmosphere. Basically, is it overcast? Is it sunny? Because this creates a completely different expression. Is it overcast? Is it sunny? Is it rainy? Stormy? Okay. And you want to be able, and you actually create that illusion through shading. You don't want to, you don't create that through just drawing a sun in your picture or drawing a cloud in your picture, because what if you can't even see the sky? Okay, so you can't limit yourself to that. You have to do it with shading. Okay, so for an example, if you're shading an object in the sun, how would you shade it differently than if you're shading an object where it was overcast? Imagine that in your mind. What do you guys think?
It'd be brighter.
Sort of. Some would be. And you're talking about obviously if it's sunny. But
Yeah.
how would you make it feel brighter? And how would you make this feel?
You would have less, it would be less, what is that word when it's like
What
the black and the whites are
Yep.
less separate. I forget the word of that.
So let's see. Yeah, it's another one of the elements that we work with. So you would have less contrast.
Yes, contrast, that word.
Okay, so that's an example of something that you would do. And you put more contrast if you're trying to create the feel of it being sunny. Okay, same thing if it's rainy, so if rainy or even stormy. So if it's actually getting dark, night and day. Okay, those are the last things that you want to be able to capture. Okay, but again, I would probably, these two might be a little more debatable about which is more important than the other. Okay, and it's not worth having the debate. They're both quite important. Okay, but that's what you're trying to do around it. Okay, so so that's what we're trying to do, what we're trying to capture. That's our purpose for why we actually shade, because we're trying to capture these things: three-dimensionality, texture, then the actual color, depth, and atmosphere. Okay, so that's
You're looking for hard edge, soft edge on the shadows, right?
Well, now we're going to get to that, which thank you for segueing us right in there, Maribeth. Which
I
is
thought that was the answer to the last question you asked.
Oh, did I ask? What was that? Oh, you mean with the rainy or stormy, or what? Okay. All right. So the next thing, let me. I'm going to shift over to our page here again. So let's share the screen here and take a look at our page. So we've just finished going over the why. Okay, so we've looked at why we shade. All right, so there is an actual purpose. So you now have a destination. Okay, so you know you have something to judge whether you have succeeded or not. Okay, did you get it look three-dimensional? Does it feel like it has texture? Again, the actual color personally is very not important. And then does it have depth and does it have atmosphere? Okay. There's probably other things you could get into conversations or even thoughts, but this is what to begin with. Start with this foundation of these things here, and then you can build and go wherever you want from there. But it's a really good foundation to begin. So how do we do this? A lot of this is going to be just very straightforward, obvious. Okay, so how do we capture form? So I already mentioned that the difference between form and shape. So in other words, how to capture form is another way of saying how to make it look three-dimensional. And that's all that we're going to focus right now. Okay. Why? Because if you capture this is what makes people ooh and ah. And let's be honest, this is a bit facetious saying this is the desired reaction, but let's be honest, it's way more exciting to do art and having people be excited about it, right? I mean, as an artist, we really are trying to, again, if you're going public, if it's just for yourself, but believe me, your heart is going to ooh and ah way more if you have, captured something like that has, some realism. You start there and then you go off into bring an emotion into it, okay? So anyway, how do we go to do this? Now, let's get back to our objects, or again, I could even focus on myself, okay? Just using my own, except I'd rather you guys stare at this. Is more interesting than my own face. So, all right. So I'm trying to shade this to look three-dimensional. So with every object you draw, if you want to make it look three-dimensional, it has to have two things. The answer to this might be so obvious you won't even be able to think of it because it's a bit of a no-brainer. But again, sometimes some things are so obvious, they're such no-brainers, we forget to focus on them. We forget to think about them. And that's why it's important to stop and point them out. So my face or the skull, what is something that is there? Two things that are present in both of them and are very important. We have to have those. What would you guys say? What are two things we see in my face and on the skull that must be there in order to make them look three-dimensional?
Light and shadow.
Oh, I think Katie was just about to, or not Katie, sorry, Elizabeth was just about to say that, weren't you? I saw her reaching for her microphone. Yeah, exactly. The highlight and the shadow, okay? You have to have highlight and shadow, okay? So this is why whenever I work on a drawing, and if you go to some sort of studio, especially like a university studio, and they're doing some still life drawing or model drawing, figure drawing, they're going to turn off all the lights and then set up spotlights so that you get very directed. And that's why I went and turned off all these lights here. Okay, so the first thing we have to have in our drawing, let's go back to the paper here. Oh, where'd my paper go? My paper disappeared. Here we go. Let's go back to here. First thing we want to have is we must include in your drawing both highlights and shadows. And I point this out because very often when we're learning, we forget to think about the highlights and we only focus on the shadows. And the reason being simply because usually when we're drawing, often when we start, we're working on a white page, and in a sense, the highlights are there already. And so all we do is focus on the shadows. But it's actually very important to focus on both. So when I often will teach, I will have students work on a mid-tone paper or even on black, where they work on black paper. And if you work on black paper, all you can do is it actually flips everything, and now you have to focus on the highlights. So you want to train yourself to focus on both of those. Here's an example of why they're both important, and you can't make something really look very three-dimensional if you're not going to have both. So for example, right, the sun, if you take a look at a photograph with the sun in it, or even look at the sun yourself in reality, well, don't, because it's bad for your eyes, but the sun has no shadow, of course, right? So it looks very two-dimensional. So it's very 2D, okay, because there's no shadow. Or if we have a silhouette, like a tree, so if we see the sun in our picture, it's behind, and here's my dead tree, but it's just a silhouette, however that is spelled, a lovely French word there. Silhouettes have no highlights. And you see this best in photography. If you're looking into, looking towards the sun, where the highlights behind it. So the highlights behind it, if the highlight is hidden on the backside of whatever the object is, in this case, a tree, you can see it. All you see is the shadowed side. And once again, it looks very flat. Silhouettes look flat, and so does the sun. This is why it's also not a good idea to necessarily, everything froze here, I see on my picture. There you go. This is why it's also a good idea when you're drawing to not go stick the sun in your picture, because as soon as you stick the sun in your picture, that means it's behind all your objects, and that really dramatically affects your shading. And to make it look realistic, you would have to silhouette everything, thus removing all your highlights, and then it doesn't look three-dimensional anymore. Okay? So this is now, first of all, to keep in mind, include both highlights and shadows. We need to have that in mind, okay? Over here. So again, so we've come to the conclusion, or we've determined that we need to include both highlights and shadows, and we need to focus on both of those. It's as important to focus on the highlights as it is the shadows. And now if we're going to shade, now specifically, what about the highlights and shadows matters most? Okay, so there's three things. So let's say we're putting in a highlight and a shadow, and that's what we want to focus on right now as we're doing this. So let's bring back, I'll use this one, the skull, because it's such a unique sort of shape. Try and see if there we go. Okay, so I'll put it like this because we get some nice unique highlights and shadows down here, especially down here where we can see both of them. So if I can hold this still at this angle. So we've got some highlight and some shadows happening right here in these areas here. Okay, so what, again, the most important thing, what is the first thing we need to focus on about this shadow, this highlight, this shadow, and so on, as we begin to shade that, okay? What's the first thing that matters? And again, this is usually the thing that people focus on the least when they're first learning. They don't actually pay much attention to this. And then this is where it gets messed up. So what do you think is the most important? And go back to drawing. I'll give you a hint. Go back to drawing. What's the most important thing when you draw? When I was talking about drawing, when you are just focusing on how to see, what did I say was the most important thing to look for? So in the same case, what do we look for? What do we notice? What should we be noticing first about this shadow? Let's just take this one right here. The most important thing. What do you think? Thoughts, anyone? Do you have an idea?
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead. Sorry?
Shapes.
Sorry, it cut out. I didn't hear you. Now you froze. Did anyone hear what she said? No, I didn't hear. Sorry, Liz. I keep talking. Okay. I'll give you a hint. What am I doing here?
The shape, the
The shape.
outline.
The shape of that shadow is super important, because the shape is the first thing that determines the three-dimensionality of it. Okay, I'm going to show you later on an example of this. And that's the thing, it may not seem like the most important thing. Okay, but the fact of what it does right here, that it comes down here and up there and so on, okay, is really important. The fact it comes down, okay. Now, sometimes it's really hard to exactly see what the shape is because of the edge or because what the edge is doing, okay. But you can see as I turn and move, that shape changes. Okay, really see how much that shape is changing, just like the shape of the object itself is changing. Okay, so just like we have to focus on, you know, just focus on the eye here, that shape is continually changing. Now the eye is not really a shadow because it's a hole there. So it's easiest to see with this bottom one. As I keep moving that, it's changing everything and the new shadow appears over here, okay? But our most important thing we always want to focus on is to really try and see the shape of our highlights and shadows. So that's number one. And I'm going to show you an example. And that's the first thing that we want to practice that. I'll show you an example of where we can see how it really, really, how it really is so important, okay? That we get those shapes. In fact, it matters so much that we can even leave out the other two and it will have a successful, there'll be limitations to it, but it will still successfully look incredibly realistic, okay? If we just get those shapes correct, okay?
Now, one says shape and blank. Are you, I mean, we have two blanks on
Yeah,
number.
okay, I see that. The shape.
Probably one's for highlights and one's for shadows.
No, because it says right there, the shape. That's a really good question, Mary Beth. I don't know. The shape and what?
Location?
Probably the location. Very good. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I was sort of, yeah, because the shape would be the size, you know, so it takes into account all those same sort of things we were talking about before, yeah. Exactly. So the shape of the shadow, which includes, so I guess that's why in my mind it's always just sort of including those things, but that's a really good thing to probably, we should point that out, is the shapes. So, you know, we may put this in here, you know, if you want to take the notes down. So including the size and location, okay?
Yeah, like the orientation to the other, you know, points of
That's
the shapes.
very good. Okay, awesome. Awesome. You guys are totally, yeah, exactly. You're thinking through this yourself and paying attention to what was actually happening and not just, you know, receiving. So the size, location, and then once again, all those same things we talked about before, the angle, the size, and all that sort of stuff, okay? Which just, when you talk about shape, is sort of, I guess, just assumed. But again, it's really good to point that out. Okay, so the next thing is now probably ends up being the thing we focus on the most. Well, when we're first learning, we actually, at least I always just try to think back to, you know, the majority of my students that I've worked with, and even myself when I was still learning. Okay, so let's look at this again. The shape, so let's say we're now focused, we've got this shape, and we want to take it further, we want to get it more realistic yet. As I moved, so the shape is changing. What else is changing? What else do you see continually changing as I move?
The shadows and the highlights.
But what about them? The shape of the shadows and the highlights is changing, and
The position.
which
Oh,
goes
yeah.
along with shape again.
Okay.
Orientation.
The orientation. What else do you see happening?
Oh, the contrast is changing, softer and harder.
Yeah, so we're getting more and more or less because what's actually changing is the dark, how dark or how light it is. You see how this one, as I move it, it's slow, it's lightening up.
The
It
depth
gets
of the
lighter and it's getting darker. So do you guys remember what we call that? What's the name of that? The light and dark? The word we use? Well, the contrast is talking about the difference between it, between dark and light.
The value.
Value, yeah. So value refers to the dark and light. So the value is changing. So you have to pay attention to the value. And even within here, to the point that the value is not constant. It changes within the shadow. It gets darker back here than up here. Let me look at this, okay? Let's take a look at this shoe. So again, this matters. If I can get that out of the way, okay? And what matters more, oh, maybe that was better before. We had a nice shadow thrown across there, okay? But the value, you know, how much, you know, this is maybe not, yeah, it's kind of harder to see. There we go. Now we can start to see some changes in value happening within here, okay? Because this is, yeah, it's so strong to see. But on this area here, we can see the value changing, you know, so much so that this is even, where do we call it highlight? You know, where does the highlight end and where does the shadow begin? Is, you know, because the value just fades out, which is going to take us to the third one that we pay attention to, okay? So the value, you can see how much lighter. So this is still shadow. We want to call that the shadow side, but it's really dark back here, right? Okay, but it does get lighter, and again, eventually becomes a highlight in this case. So second thing that we pay attention to, the most important thing, is the value. Okay, and I'm going to say the value within the highlight and shadow, because that just sort of helps you remember that it's not constant. That only comes with experience. Like the more you do it, your eye will begin to see it more. And when you just start, when you're just starting, and you're not going to see it right away. Again, right now, this looks like it's darker here than there, but that's only because that's the coloration. That's not the change in the value. I have another example here. See if this will help, because this is another good exercise. This is really, there we go. Okay. This is a really, really good practice, by the way. If you really want to practice some shading, just take a roll of toilet paper, unloose a little bit like this, and just practice. And you can see the change in values from this. Whoops, I'm messing up. This is a little bit lighter than that, and then this one is darker yet. Okay, and then where this one gets darker and it gets lighter, and it just keeps changing. And you get with using a little bit of toilet paper, it gives you a sense of doing drapery. Okay, so now that value really matters a whole lot there. So that's our second thing. Actually, while I have this up, I'll use this to see what's the last thing then that really matters. I'll give you a hint. I talked about it. See this shadow here? It fades away. If I tilt this, if I move this out of the way, see this shadow, how it changes? Fades away, but then look at this shadow. What is happening differently from this shadow as it gets lighter and becomes a highlight, and this shadow down here and becomes a highlight? See if I can find another one to show you, or watch this one here. This shadow, oh, I just touched it and messed it up. Trying to be able to show it to you, be able to see it. Because it's so extreme lighting, it's maybe a bit harder to notice. Okay. So this shadow, what is different between this shadow as it approaches the light and this shadow as it approaches the light. What is
One
different?
soft transition, one is a more severe transition.
Exactly. So we
Hard-
pay close attention to the edges of the shapes. Oh, let's get where you can see it. The edges of the shapes. Are they soft or hard? Okay. Soft meaning you have a shadow and it comes to the edge of the shadow or the edge of the shape and it fades away. And that's a real challenge. That's why shading can become so difficult when you get into things like shading the face and still being able to capture the form and the realism is because you have to be able to shade that soft edge and still retain the shape. This is where most people lose the shape. Okay, that's why shape is so important, and that's a challenge, and that takes practice and a lot of practice to be able to create soft edges because you have a shape that has soft and hard. Okay, so for example, and by the way, every soft edge shape indicates curve. So if we have a cylinder, and that's what I have in that example in that worksheet, a cylinder is soft, it's gradual, but a sudden, if it has a corner, then it changes quickly and it happens immediately. Okay, there's no gradation, there's no transition. Okay, everything goes very suddenly. Dark, boom, suddenly becomes light. Okay, however, very soft. So let's take a look at that roll of toilet paper again. That determines then what is happening. Okay, so if we just, let me get this out of the way, let's just look at just the cylinder itself right here. Because there's a corner, it's very sudden from dark to light. Because this is round, it's very gradual. So when you're doing drapery, that's why it's such a good study, is drapery is just full of tight curves, gradual curves, and that changes too. So the tighter the curve, the edge is not as soft. Okay, if it's a very gradual curve, it becomes softer. Okay, so the camera only sort of is able to pick this up, but all of those little edges in there. Okay, and then we get into reflected light, but we're not going to deal with that right now. Okay, so that's sort of the last thing, but it is still important, but we can get away with that. So this is going to bring me to, let me go over this. Where do we begin now practicing? As I just said, it takes a lot of practice. So I would say your first thing to always practice with, and this is what I've always done with my students, is just have them practice shape. Seeing the shape of the highlights and shadows. Let me take you to an example of that. So I'm going to share the screen here in a minute. We're going to take a look at this. Okay, you can see my screen now, I think. I'm going to share. Let's bring this right up. Slideshow. Okay. Can you guys all see the screen, the big yellow slide with
Yes.
this funny black and white blob? Okay. All right. So I'm just going to walk you guys through it. And okay. So all I want you to do right now is just pay attention to these black and white blobs. Okay. Because as we get to see more and more is revealed to us, and it's going to become pretty obvious pretty quick, but we see that blobs are not just blobs, but they actually begin to form something, okay? They're very distinct shapes, okay? And the whole thing ends up forming an image, okay? But taken in and of themselves, they really are just blobs. So for instance, now when we see the whole, okay, we can see that this is actually an eye, and this is another eye, and they look dramatically different, okay?
Hey, we're stuck on the same first image.
Oh, really? It didn't advance for you guys?
Not on mine.
No?
Did it advance on other people's?
No, I got the same first one.
Oh, well, that doesn't help. Okay, so let me, I guess we'll just have to do it this way. We'll have to just, you can see it now though, right?
Yes.
And if I go to the next image like this?
Yeah.
Okay. Funny, it doesn't let me do it that way. Here we go. I'll enlarge it that way. So we'll just advance through it this way. Okay, so if we, the very first image, okay, it's just blobs, but as we go through and we get to see more and more and more, we can see, now you guys can begin to see this is starting to form into something, right? It's forming into an elephant here. And in fact, we find out, okay, so the whole thing becomes very realistic. Now, what I want to show you here is I've paid no attention to value. Value has been obliterated and it's just been turned into extreme black, okay? Edge has also been obliterated and everything is hard edge. There's no soft edges in here whatsoever. Even though everything in this elephant is curved, so there should be full of soft edges, but you can get away with obliterating that if your shapes are accurate. And that's the thing that I want you guys to be able to see. That's why shape matters so much. If you tried the other way, it would not work. If you tried to have all your accurate values, let's take a look at the two of them. Where did this come from? In fact, here's the elephant right here. Okay, so this came from this photograph here. If you had accurate values all through here, but these edges were not accurate of the shape, it wouldn't work, okay? If you had all your soft and hard edges in good place, but you didn't have the actual shape, it also wouldn't work. Oh, I think it stopped recording here for some reason. Oh, maybe not. No, I guess it's still recording. I don't know. Still learning about all this Zoom stuff, okay? So that's what we have going on here. So we're gonna have to skip, you won't be able to see all that. Here's another example that I always use, okay? It is so important and shape matters so much that we can look at this, and this is just a bunch of blobs, you know, like think about, if we were to zoom in on that, that would not look like an eye whatsoever, okay? Neither would this, but you put them all together, and in fact, we even know who that is, right? We can, that's Martin Luther King Jr. You know, it's incredible. This is Charlie Chaplin, okay? We can see that this person is Greek, okay? We can tell that's a cow and a chimpanzee, and it's crazy how much it works. So this is the other document that I shared with you guys, which is the first side, where we practice this by taking, and the reason why I use a face like this, you know, a recognizable person, in this case, Albert Einstein, because if you pull it off, you'll see, whoa, here's Albert Einstein, okay? I could hide this, show this to someone, and if someone has seen Albert Einstein before, someone who knew would be able to look at that and say, yeah, that's Albert Einstein. But yet it's just black and white shapes. So the power of accurate shape is quite staggering. Why our brain works that way. It does. Our brain can leave out all the other stuff, and this matters. So this is why I always have the students really focus on this first, and then you can just let go of the value, let go of the soft edge, and just get those shapes accurate. Okay, now again, look at this eye, because here's the challenge when it comes to drawing realism. I want you to see those shapes there. I'm going to stop sharing, because when we begin, we think of eyes like this, and when we go to draw an eye, we do something like this, you know, And then we draw a nose, and then we say, oh, let's shade it. So we shade that in dark, and we shade that in dark. And then we say, oh, let's, put a shadow there. And then we make, the mouth. And then we make the mouth dark because we're thinking about local actual color. We're not actually thinking about highlights and shadows. Here we tried to, and then we shade in some eyebrows. Okay. And we get something which is far from realism. So our brain has to change entirely. And we have to now begin to see the shape. Now I'm going to draw Einstein's, what's the left side on the left eye on the page. Let me see if I can get that better angle. And it's an absolutely, I'm going to do this really fast. So it's not accurate at this point, just for the sake of not boring you guys. But this is an eye, for Pete's sake. Like that's crazy. But that is an eye, right? And then of course we have to fill that in. And that takes a while for, like I said, it's always about seeing. That takes a while to train your no, so everyone's got, some are going to have that naturally. Some people have no trouble with that. Okay. Now my phone died. Are you guys all still on?